Good evening. Seven o'clock, I'd like to call public hearing of the Stratford Inland Wetlands and Water Course Commission to order. Tonight's public hearing concerns application 2016-7, paragraph V, development of a single-family residential dwelling, 2,800 square feet within an upland review area of wetlands and restoration of regulated upland habitat, 33,000 square feet, which was previously clear-cut without the benefit of a permit. Site address 350 Whippoorwill Lane, Stratford, Connecticut. Assessor's reference map, block 50.16, block 1, lot 82, violator / applicant Shayna Wolf. Is the applicant or her representative present?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Madam Secretary, Mr. Chairman, gentlemen of the Wetlands Commission. My name is Nicholas E. Owen. I reside at 4 Whippoorwill Lane in Stratford. I am a number of properties from the site which is on your agenda this evening, and we are here this evening in an effort to comply with a violation that was performed on this property without the benefit of the owner coming to this commission for a permit to do what he did. I have with me this evening Mr. Brian Hirsch. He is the individual who is the contractor on this particular piece of property. His wife, Shayna, is the owner of the property. And at this time, I would like to introduce Mr. Brian Hirsch to you, who would like to say a few words to the Commission. Mr. Hirsch.
I guess first and foremost, I want to formally apologize to the neighbors that I affected directly by this. I apologize to you people for doing what I did. I made a mistake. I understand that. I recognize it, and I intend to rectify the situation as best as I physically can. And I'm sorry. I made a mistake. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Hirsch. In compliance with some of the requirements set forth by this commission, I would like to submit as evidence into the record the certified mailings that were sent to those affected property owners. Thank you. Further, I would like to indicate to the commission is that we are certainly not looking for a fight with the neighbors. There is no question that they have been injured by the work that was performed on this property without the benefit of appearing before, Mr. Hirsch appearing before this commission without a permit. And to that end, Mr. Hirsch knocked on my door since he was aware of the fact that I am a developer in this town for 40 some odd years and have appeared before many boards and commissions in an effort to obtain permits in order to construct different developments, housing, condominiums, shopping centers, and office buildings. To that end, I told Mr. Hirsch that I would be more than happy to help him, but that he would have to allow me to hire who I felt were the appropriate professionals in order to correct what he had done. So he has more or less given me complete control over who to hire, what their task was, what their charge was, what they saw, what they did, and what their recommendations to this commission were. And what I would like to do at this point in time is introduce you to Mr. Stuart H. Sachs. He's a PLA, an ASLA, a principal in this company, and I don't pretend to know what those designations are, but I'm sure Mr. McCann would know, and I'm sure Mr. Sachs will be more than happy to tell you. Mr. Sachs?
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, Madam Secretary, staff, and commissioners. Before I continue, I just thought I'd tell you I only have one page of notes to talk about. I have a plan that I'd like to show, and I'm not sure where it would be most convenient for you to see it. First of all, as a consultant, I should tell you that I'm a licensed landscape architect, state of Connecticut, and a number of other states. I've also been a professor of landscape architecture for many years, and as a practicing professional, one of the things that I like to do most often with clients is do what I call managed expectations. I only wish I had met Brian about 6 or 8 months ago, in part because not only has what he done a mistake, an error, it's also going to be very costly for him from the sense of long-term maintenance and from an understanding of what the ecology is in the area. Before he cleared the site, I could see today remnants of both the number of trees that he cut down, but also a number of wetland plants and even a number of invasive species. And the plan that I've developed is through the basis of 2 consultants that I occasionally work with. You may know them. One is Barbara Wilson. The other is Matt Popp. Barbara Wilson of Barbara Wilson Landscape Architects and Matt Popp of Environmental Services. 2 of them have concurred on the planting that we're showing. And for the record, I would like to give you a little handout. I'm not sure if I use the term facultative plants or obligate plants. You know what that means, so I just have a little handout. It's a diagram of sorts. In the technical sense of the word, and in the Connecticut DEP, the environmental practices call for the work that we're doing as facultative wetland plants. The other group of wetland plants are obligate. An obligate is not unlike saying obliged or required. And obligate wetland plants are in water part of the year. And we're dealing with the upland areas, and those are facultative. They can get extremely wet, but they don't sit in water and live. And if you look at the list of 1,700 plants that Mr. Hirsch is going to have to plant, you will see that they all are selected and shown to be in areas of varying degrees according to that diagram that I've given you. If you can visualize the line indicating the edge of the wetlands delineated by Otto Thiel, soil scientist, the plants closest to that are truly plants that are wetland and obligate facultative, right on the edge. And that's the small plants that'll be the closest barrier to the wetlands. When they get planted, there's no additional clearing that will be done. It's more a matter of finding the space to put these in. And when they're being planted, the contractors will also be probably keeping aware of what invasive plants are there and removing them. Any future maintenance is part of a maintenance defined plan that's on the action sheet. There's a rock boulder boundary which will be installed to prevent people from getting mowers into that 50-foot setback area. There will be some annual maintenance of the plantings in the area. The maintenance is not pruning, clipping, shearing, making aesthetic choices. It's the removal of invasive plants only. If there are woody stem plants coming in, the simplest thing to do, woody stem invasive plants coming in, like the wild roses, the multiflora rose, or the barberry. These plants will be cut at the ground level and continuously cut. There's no ripping out of the soil necessary. These are not an extrication or an extraction removal practices. And aside from the work that's being addressed at the site, long-term, the plan I've shown is essentially a mitigation measure only. It is not an aesthetic suburban residential landscape plan. This is put in because it's a variety of both wetland plants as facultative requirements, and a number of evergreens are also being included as habitat for some of the birds that would be in that area that could use the cover all year long from evergreen trees as a nesting site. That's why the uppermost area of the site has got evergreens planted in it. The planting plan is colored, and I'm hoping you can sort of see the dots, the circles that are shaded to represent trees. Understand that if you got up closer to this illustrative plan, you could see penciled circles that I've drawn on the plan, which I think indicate the trees in about 20 to 25 years. That entire 50-foot setback area will be shade covered within the next 15 or 20 years from the growth of the trees that are being proposed. The understory plantings, a number of them are both chosen for their proximity to the wetlands, but also for some concern for wildlife habitat. Again, that's part of my particular interest, that the plants are both bearing either summer, fall, or winter time fruit for the animals. And I say animals because I'm not just referring to birds. There's probably a good number of other smaller rodents and squirrels or woodchucks or mice or whatever that are in the woods that'll be in this area. I think also that as a measure for the planting, I'll recommend something that's not specifically indicated on the plan, nor is it a typical requirement of wetland plantings, but I do recommend at the time of planting that the contractors broadcast a selective wetland seed mix of wildflowers and grasses. So in addition to the 1,700 plants that are going in, I know that there will be the opportunity for a good many more plants coming up in the future. Having said that, if we probably did nothing in the next 4 or 5 years, the afforested growth in this ecology, now that the tree canopy is gone, would having sunlight striking down to the near ground levels. I say near ground level because there's an awful lot of 3-4 foot high plants that are now brown and sitting there. The flourish of plants that'll come up this summer, I don't doubt that you may be getting things like oxeye daisies and other sorts of wildflowers that you haven't seen in that area for decades, obviously because there wasn't enough sunlight for them to either bloom, grow, germinate, whatever. Now that the tree canopy is gone, it'll be a different story. We're not going to wait for that. I think as the mitigation plan, as the planting plan, this landscape plan will be fairly restorative. It has nothing to do particular with the house approval. I suspect that when the house is built, the driveway installed, after that will come the turf cover, the lawn, and any other additional plants or trees that the owner wishes to add to that plan. I might add that, as with any wetland soil scientist's application or report, even in the last word of Otto Thiel's report, he said that the information he has given is as he best understands it, but it's submitted for your understanding and your approval and not official until that time. So I say that because this plan, the work I do, is always open to either recommendations or changes. And I would like to note that the improvements hopefully are not subjective. I bounced the idea of this planting plan off of 2 professionals besides myself. It's a practice that I normally do. As a sole practitioner, I always value opinions of others. These are not plantings made as an aesthetic choice from alignment. They are the aesthetic of a restoration plan only. I'll take any questions you have or comments.
Mr. McCann. Excuse me. What time period do you think is necessary, in your expert opinion, to assure the success and establishment of hardiness of these plants? Do you have any recommendations to this commission in that regard?
Yes. You're talking about establishment maintenance. There's planting establishment. Most landscape contractors would offer you a 1-year guarantee on any plant or shrub or tree sort of thing. That's not enough usually. We typically speak of a 3-year time period for establishment maintenance. That's part of what I've described as the work that will be needed, that I'll be examining and reviewing and observing this site seasonally for a total of 3 years.
So it's your recommendation that this commission should article a minimum of 3 years of guarantee?
I don't know about a minimum, but I would definitely say 3 years. I don't have what I...
Let's just say 3 years, not use maximum or minimum. Is that your recommendation?
Yes.
3 years? Are you in any way, as the landscape architect, making a recommendation or overseeing the planting of these trees and shrubs? How do we know, what should this commission do to make sure that, with your expertise, it's wonderful, but it's only as good as the guy who has the shovel. Nobody can hear me? Oh, I'm sorry.
The question is, how do you know the veracity of what gets planted
Well,
where?
what is in terms of us putting together a permit for this, we have to have some assurance that that's going to happen. Normally, there's a bond in that regard, but the better policy is to have somebody, the guy who designs it watches it, let's put it that way simply.
Well, I have already given Nick Owen and Brian Hirsch a contract, and I believe it's item either 6 or 7 that says I observe and verify all the plantings to be as specified, in location as agreed and defined on the plan. I'll stand behind that as a person, Boy Scout, you name it. I'm pretty positive that this will be done.
Is that in any way reflected in our information that we have toward a permit?
I didn't see anything to that effect, but I trust the word of Mr. Sachs that he would stick with the project through at least 3 years of the restoration plan, and we could, of course, make that a term of permit and specifically name Mr. Sachs that he needs to be the one that has designed the plan, that will be out to monitor the plantings, ensure that all installed plants are healthy upon installation and are maintained appropriately through the course of the 3 years. We could specifically write his name in the permit, and should that ever change, the applicant would have to come back before the commission as a permit modification, essentially, if they want to move forward with using another landscape architect who is not Mr. Sachs. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. To you, Madam Administrator, are we putting a bond on this specific aspect?
There's certainly going to have to be a bond on the replanting.
On the restoration aspect as well as...
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
I would also, Nick just said that we'd be more than willing to stipulate to that as a requirement. And I'd also be happy to provide a photocopy of a signed agreement that I have. This is a legal contract. And items 6, I review contract awarding. Item 7 is construction observation. Item 8 is post-construction service. All these things are spelled out specifically. I'd be glad to give a copy to Christina.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I have a question. I mean, my main concern is that, number one, we have to rule on the completeness of the restoration plan. And according to this gentleman, it's going to take possibly 3 years for the development of these plantings and all the restoration of what was destroyed to regrow. And then we have to come up with a decision on the house itself. I don't see how the two can happen so quickly. I have a big problem with building this house before the restoration takes effect. I'm not saying that I have a problem with the building of the house, but with all the construction that's going to go on with the construction phase of this house and all the perimeter construction that has to go around the house, that I can't imagine making a ruling on this until we see how the restoration develops.
I also have to say I'm in agreement with that, especially after the plans were resubmitted and revised recently. You'll notice actually that the footprint of the home has moved closer to the wetland than the original plan we received. So that was something that I'm assuming the home was moved closer to the wetlands because of the need to put in the septic system and leaching fields in front of the home, in addition to the stormwater management system. So all of that meant that the residence itself had to move closer to the wetland, which you're getting really close to the area where once you start building this house, you're absolutely going to have an effect on the restored area you've created. So one of the things that I had been thinking through when I was reviewing this application was, step one is do the restoration we could do it one of two ways. You could have two separate applications, one that we approve for the restoration, then after the restoration has been effectively completed, perhaps after a year and a half, when everything's in the ground and at least has had a chance to establish, then the applicant can come back in for the home. And that would all be contingent upon how well the restoration area has taken and the word of Mr. Sachs on whether he believes it's doing well and will be able to withstand anything that's taking place in terms of construction on the property for the home. Another way we can handle it is have essentially a two-part permit where the permit is conditioned so that the restoration must take place first and must be approved by Mr. Sachs and then by the commission before you can move on to phase 2 of the permit, which would be the building of the home. I also think it would be prudent that after the restoration has taken place, the applicant grant a conservation easement in favor of the town on that area so that the restored area will never again be denuded the way that it was, should the property ever change hands.
Ms. Baytog, if I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, I apologize. We would prefer your second scenario, obviously your second and third, or second A and B, to where we first obviously restore the upland area with the plantings that Mr. Sachs has described for the commission. And let me backtrack just slightly. His charge was not to just restore and enhance what was disturbed, but to, I'm going to use the term, go overboard and do more than what is normally accepted, what the minimum requirement was because of the problem that was caused up there. So that's something that I want to clarify for the commission. Number two, as I indicated, there's no objection to first the restoration of the upland area, the wetlands, to hold up the second part and not allow Mr. Hirsch to continue with the construction of a single-family home, which is going to be his permanent residence. He's going to become a resident of Stratford, would be and I know I'm going to get flack from the audience, an undue hardship on him. What the commission may not understand is not only does he have to do the restoration, not only does he need permission from this commission as to the type, the form, and the way this restoration plan is done, he also needs approval from the commission to establish the house in this area by you good people. And to that extent, you're going to hear shortly from the engineer. With respect to your comment that your plan indicates that the location of the home has been moved closer to the wetlands, although it is not encroaching in the wetlands, it can be moved. Setback. Thank you. It can be moved forward again. There were several locations where a main septic system could be installed, several locations where a secondary reserve system can be installed. So we have movement on that lot to move that house a little bit further away from the wetlands, and you will hear that from our engineer. What the commission also needs to understand is this is not the only commission that Mr. Hirsch has to appear before. If this is approved, and we hope it is approved by your commission, we know a restoration plan will be approved. It has to be approved because that has to be corrected. Mr. Hirsch also has to appear at some point in time before the Board of Zoning Appeals for a waiver of street width. I'm sure some of you or all of you have been up in that area. That is probably one of the oldest access driveways on Whippoorwill Lane, and I would suggest to you one of the oldest accesses in the town of Stratford. It's really an old farmer road up in that area. There is a fairly large house on top of that hill. There is a fairly small house at the bottom of that hill, and in between is Mr. Hirsch's property, which exceeds in all respects a location for a single-family home in a 1-acre zone. So we know we can at least get approval from the third step, which is a planning commission for what is termed a re-subdivision of that property into 3 lots, which would be the location where the smaller house is at the bottom of the hill, where the house is at the top of the hill, and this lot in the middle. But we have to jump through hoops with 3 different boards and commissions in order to solidify this. But we are here only for the first step and a half, which is the restoration plan and the plan to determine the location of a home which we anticipate will be built at some point in time. So to hold that process up is just going to take that much longer to complete the entire thing. Again, no issue with planting, no issue with restoring, no issue with fencing off that area that has been restored, no issue with Mr. Sachs. He's under contract for a 3-year look-see. No issue with replanting those shrubs or plants or trees that don't take within that 3-year period. So we understand the hurdles that we have to jump through to do this. And I hope that fully answers your question. Thank you.
How about the conservation easement?
Oh, I'm sorry. There is no issue with stipulating a conservation easement. We're more than happy to give it to the town.
Yeah, if I could just ask Mr. Owen. So in other words, if we approve the restoration plan, okay, and then hear the permit on the building of the house, and then you're going to go in front of BZA after you come before this commission, everything is going to be contingent on how the restoration of that upland wetland area performs, which could take 3 years. Okay? So you're willing to hold everything in limbo for 3 years before you can really start putting a shovel in the ground on this house. Is that what you're saying?
That's not what I said.
Okay.
And I want you...
Because that's what I want.
I know that's what you want, but with all respect, I want you to understand that the first step, as I previously indicated, Mr. Commissioner, is that we are going to do the restoration plan. There is going to be a 3-year look-see period to make sure that that restoration plan and those plantings take place. Or continue to grow. And we hope they're going to continue to grow, and we're pretty positive that 90% of them will continue to grow in that area. We are willing to fence that area off so there is no intrusion when and if we are able to obtain our other permits other than this agency to build a home on that lot. It's pretty difficult to ask us to wait 3 years. Now,
I'm not saying it's going to be 3 years, but it could take 3 years. If our staff is satisfied within a year or a year and a half, okay, she could release the second part of your application. But I'm just saying that there's a possibility it could take that long. Or if this fails, it cannot happen at all. All right? I just want the applicant to be aware of that. To put the board through this process now without seeing how this progresses over a period of time. That's all I'm asking.
Give me a second.
Am I right? What do you think?
The season will tell you whether or not it's going to grow, because they can plant this spring, make it through the summer.
Yeah, it should be fine.
It should be fine.
Right, tell them that.
Again, for the record, this is Stuart Sachs speaking. I suspect that the plantings can take about maybe 2 weeks. And if they're accomplished this spring, which I am presuming they will be, if they make it through the summer, which is going to be the more difficult part of its first year of growing, I think the seasonal growth through the summer, continued growth. I'm scheduled to be looking at this in the fall. I'll be happy to add more visits. But I don't see the validity of what you call waiting 3 years.
Could I just interrupt you?
Sure.
Okay, I've been doing this for 18 years on this commission.
Okay?
And the main concern we're going to have here is soil stabilization. Okay?
All right.
All right? That's what it's all about. What he did, he destabled that area by cutting everything. You're not going to tell me in 2 weeks you're going to stabilize that area with your plantings. Okay? I can't see it happening. And then, in a short period of time, you're going to start construction of a home. All right? It's an upland area. The topography feeds down to the wetland area.
Right.
All right? Our concern is protecting that wetland area. That's all I'm saying. All right? I think time is going to be the issue here. I'm not saying it's going to fail. I'm not saying we're not going to approve this. But it's time. And you're not going to tell me in 2 weeks you're going to be able to stabilize that whole area.
No, I mean,
I don't think
That's-
he
that's-
was. I think he's
that's
just saying
not-
that within 2 weeks, he'll see which plants are essentially taking, and if they're not taking to the soil, he can remove them and put in a new plant.
Okay.
To ensure
Okay.
that
But
the
see,
homes
but
are-
there's where you're going to stretch out your time period. That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying.
well, there are other mitigation elements. Perhaps the most significant one that's required is a silt fence.
right.
before-
Deep silt fence, I understand that.
Right. So we're having that as the initial barrier, and nothing between the 50-some-odd foot setback, 50-foot setback, and the wetland soil. There's no more further disturbance of that area. And right now, I think most of the stuff out there is about this high. It's not open, raw soil. I would agree with you 100% that if it was open soil, water flows downhill, the carrying capacity would be erosion. There's a good deal of vegetation out there, and that's why I stated earlier that there'll be no additional clearing, just planting. I think your concern is well-founded, and I understand that. This is part of the problem of the owner has brought upon himself, and I appreciate your comments.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question about when the cuttings were done, are the stumps left there, or were the stumps removed? Were they cut up? What's happening with the stumps that are left there?
Well, I've seen a good many of the stumps. I don't know if any were ground out. That's a question for the contractor or the owner. But They stay.
Okay.
Mr. Commissioner, there were none of those stumps ground out. They're still there.
So they're still there, and they're going to remain there?
Yes.
Right.
Okay.
Because that's used as part of the stabilization process.
The only reason I'm asking it is I'd be concerned about decay of those stumps and any termites or insects infesting those stumps, and then transferring that to the new plantings
Well,
and killing the plants.
the termites are a vital and necessary insect in our ecology, bar none. Prior to that, you'll probably get a good deal of carpenter ants that'll go in first. But they will not, neither of those two insects go after live plants. If they're going after anything, they're part of God's, if you will, pardon the expression, recycling team. They're necessary. We'd be up to our eyeballs if it wasn't for fungus and termites and carpenter ants and any number of other insects that help with decay. Mm-hmm. They do the recycling. We need them.
I had a question. Am I to understand you're putting more trees or bushes than you actually need to stabilize this? With, Mr. Wade's question, if there's stumps and everything right there, are you putting yearly old trees or bushes in? Why don't you lessen it and put older trees in?
Well,
would be-
if you look on the planting list, the trees they're putting in some cases, are 6 and 7 feet tall as evergreens. They're 1.5 and 2 inch, I believe.
Well, there's a ton of stumps there now. So you'd be defeating the purpose, choking them off, correct?
I don't understand your question. Would you
Well, if you plant too much, the stumps that are there are not going to let it grow.
The question is not a matter of too much. It's what is the standard practice? If you go to your zoning regulations, somehow somebody in a suburban office someplace said, if you have a parking lot, plant 1 tree every 40, 50 feet. The validity of that is not on science. It's on someone's opinion. If I go out in the forest, I can see maples by the dozens growing within a few feet of each other. Which one is right? I think the opportunity is that we plant to establish the ecology. I would be willing to bet that the density maybe 50 or 75 years ago was probably 3 or 4 times as many trees. They weren't very big, but survival of the fittest comes into an existence. I don't doubt that this plan, all of the plants, I will assure you, will be alive in 3 years. In 5 or 10 years, I'm not so sure. I don't know the establishment of the ecology. I don't know how much the neighbors are spraying their lawns with insecticides, herbicides, this sort of stuff. I'm trying to balance what I know aesthetically, scientifically, to get a result that years down the road will be very similar or maybe even better than what was there. But I'll never say better because I won't be alive then.
Just before we move on, I would definitely like to see a revised site plan that shows the residents moved back closer to where the original location was in the first iteration of the plan, where it was. Go ahead.
The resolution of where the house ended up, is driven by where are the better places to put the septic systems and the stormwater.
Understood.
And then there's your health regulations that require setbacks away from them. I think the engineer can address those questions.
Okay.
Tina, we could cover that with the engineer, who could probably clarify a couple of your questions and concerns of the commission. Would that be okay? Now, Mr. Sachs is going to obviously remain here for any further questioning or clarification. So if you are at least temporarily complete with asking him, then I will bring up Mr. DeAngelis, and he can issue his report, his findings, and clarify for the commission and to Tina, new location, what he found, what we think we can do, and so forth. So I would like to bring up Mr. DeAngelis at this juncture. Thank you. Mr. DeAngelis? Would you please read who you are, where you're from, your credentials into the record, and then go ahead.
Absolutely. Thank you. My name is Chris DeAngelis, professional engineer with Cabezas DeAngelis. Our office is in Bridgeport. I am licensed as a professional engineer in the states of Connecticut, New York, and California. I am also certified as a water quality design professional, certified professional in water quality, CPSWQ, by EnviroCert International, which is a private certification agency. I was brought into the project relatively late, about a month ago, and asked to do the technical design. I'll clarify a couple of things. Initially, when I saw the house plan, we did some test pitting out at the site, and I felt that I'm going to put my plan up if you don't mind. I know you have a copy of this. So initially, the house was in the center of the site. After doing some initial test pitting, I felt that the best placement for the house would have been to push it back. Stuart and I talked about this quite a bit. It might seem counterintuitive to move it closer to the wetlands, but I was able to convince Stuart, and hopefully it was...
Hold up 1 second, change the tape.
Sure.
Okay.
So regarding the placement of the house, there are some benefits to placing it closer to the wetlands. Number one, we increase the front lawn area quite a bit. This allows for all the active recreation that Mr. Hirsch or any other future homeowner who might occupy the house to have all their activities take place up front. I felt before that the house was maybe in the center of the lot, and there might be incentive for activities to take place around the entire house, including in the backyard, which is closer to the wetlands, which obviously you don't want. So by putting the house further to the back, yes, we allow more room for us to put in the sanitary system, the stormwater system, but it also really reduces the likelihood that they're going to, put in a garden in the backyard, or have, Frisbee games back there, or wiffle ball games with the kids, or a swing set. There's really very limited room back there now to do that sort of thing. So you've still got your 50-foot buffer. Stuart felt it was enough room to get the restoration plant, the correct number of restoration plants installed. And then this leaves the homeowner with a lot of room in front to do all their activities that they want to do. Also, when we looked at the hydrology of the site, we realized that although the entire site's about an acre in size, it's only about, I think it's 26,000 square feet or so that actually flows back towards the wetland. The center of the site is the high point, and the north half of the site, the rear part of the property, flows towards the wetlands, and the south half of the site flows down towards Whippoorwill Lane. So the area that's going into the wetlands is not necessarily as large as the entire property itself. So by placing the house further back, we're really we're pulling all that water from the front of the house and all the front yard. It's all being discharged now down towards Whippoorwill Lane. We've installed a fairly large detention system, much larger than we normally would for a residential house. I think we have 20 Coltech chambers. Normally for a single-family house, we might have 3 or 4 or a dozen at the most. But this is a very robust infiltration system, and that's because we've, again, placed the house at the back. We've left this room for the front. We don't want to send any more water down to Whippoorwill Lane than is allowed, than the existing conditions dictate, and flood out Whippoorwill Lane. So we put in this large detention system. So there were some good reasons for pushing that house towards the back. I hope that everyone realizes that. We do have some room in the front to move the sanitary system around, but I feel like where it's placed now in the front center of the site is the best place. I've been to the site on 3 days. On April 5th, I did some preliminary test pitting with the contractor. And then on April 11th and April 19th, I did test pitting, which were also witnessed by Ms. Maureen Whalen from your town sanitation department, public health department. We have made a final submission to her for the sanitary septic system. She had some very minor comments on that. We expect approval on that next week or the week after. And other than that, it's I think for a single-family residential house, we've certainly done our homework. We have a robust sediment erosion control plan, which you see. It's something more applicable to a larger development where you might have an acre or more of disturbance. Here we have approximately half an acre. So there's certainly nothing lacking in the plan or in the homework that we've done. Sure. So, having been at the site now 3 times and spent, probably 4 to 5 hours on each time, I've had a chance to look at it. I don't see any visible signs of erosion. They did leave all the stumps in place. They didn't grub them out. The sill fence was in pretty good shape, but I did recommend that they back it up with hay bales. If it's going to be there for a while, the hay bales will help to keep it up in case, it gets knocked over by, an animal or kids playing or anything. So on our plan, we do show the hay bale backups to the sill fence. We have the standard erosion control notes that tell the contractor when he's to replace material. We show the soil stockpile area, which is away from the wetlands. We have the other typical items, the anti-tracking pad that, again, you'd see on a much larger development where there's more disturbed area. So for single-family residential residents, we've really, beefed up the erosion control plans as we were directed to do.
Quick question. On the plans, it shows what I believe is a rock outcropping directly beneath the west side of the home. Is that the case? Yes. And so is that rock outcropping just staying there? Do you need to fill over it? Because when I look at the cross-sectional plan, it looks like topographically the house is going to be on the top of the slope, but a portion of it is going to be over the downslope going towards the wetlands. So I'm just curious if you need to bring fill in and what the quantity would be to level it out to build the home.
No fill, they're just going to walk down it.
This is Stuart Sachs speaking. One of the ironies of doing a cross-section is that it's at one line.
I didn't see one.
The house is either for or after that, and I've sort of indicated the height that the house will be. I think at the previous hearing, you mentioned that there should be no blasting. And this is a location that I would recommend something like Dexpan or Betaminate be used as a rock splitting device so that they can crack the rocks out, put in the foundation as necessary.
Okay, so there's the major part of my question is there going to be fill brought to the site? The answer is no.
There's not going to be fill brought in. It's essentially like taking the cookie cutter, if you will, and pushing it into the ground for the foundation.
Yeah, I got a question. I got a proposed drawing and his drawing. It's only 6 inches from one to the other. What are we complaining about, 6 inches?
The restoration.
The restoration is,
That shows 53.6.
you're talking 6 inches to move a house? Why are you even bothering? I don't understand that. The drawing here says 53 feet 6 inches, and this one says 54 inches.
54 feet?
54 feet, I'm sorry. That's 6 inches. All this to move the house 6 inches? I don't understand it.
No. There was an original planting plan.
But you're talking about moving the house, which the planning from the wetlands to the house, and this one that they're proposing is 53 feet 6 inches.
And I'm talking about a previously submitted,
Well, here's the other one.
no, there was,
You
What
are
we
talking
I'm
about
confused.
elevation
I'm not worried about the elevation, I'm worried
versus
about
setback.
distance. I know, I'm very familiar with what you're talking about.
Okay, my plan, I made it a little more minimum, 53 feet, 6 inches,
Okay,
rounded
I
off 54.
understand it, but I'm just saying is you're moving it, but if you're only moving it nowheres versus, I mean, how far are we moving it?
Chris,
this was the original.
No, but they're asking.
depending upon the final foundation, excavation, look,
And the house was set way further towards the road. Set well away from the wetlands, so I was concerned as to why they moved the house to the north. in the
Oh, I
plan
see what
that
you're saying, okay.
And they
Well,
just,
out of these two, it didn't make any sense, so, whatever. I apologize.
yeah, that's,
Okay, I understand, I just was concerned if you're moving this one to this
it
one.
may
I didn't see the
move as
move.
much as 5 additional feet away from the
I respect
regulated area.
Mr. Ducerone, did that fully answer your question?
it. Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
you're welcome.
Yeah, I just have a couple of questions. You can have city water.
Yes, there will be city water.
How about, you going to run gas up there? Are you going to have fuel?
There is, at that location on Whippoorwill Lane, there's no gas, it'll probably be
gas?
oil. Yeah.
You have an in-basement oil tank?
Probably a 330 oil tank in the basement.
In basement?
Yes.
Okay. And a full basement?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
No more questions, go to public hearing.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit for the record, if you don't already have a copy of it, and I think it was submitted with the application, the drainage study,
yes, it was submitted, and I,
distributed amongst,
did it among
okay.
the commissioners.
Thank you.
Everybody has a copy.
And we would like to, so I don't forget, submit these documents into the record as exhibits also.
May I ask a question about the drainage study? I don't know if it's okay. Could you just explain to me the disclaimer on page 2 and 3, and actually I think it goes on at the top of the page, in terms of the report is prepared with free hydroclad?
With, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that?
Of your study?
Oh, the HydroCAD output. I was wondering if anyone would know that. So HydroCAD is a program that we use. It's a very common program. We got a new computer in the office recently, so until we purchase another license, we just downloaded the free version. But it's it's essentially the same version as anything else. Yeah, I actually thought about maybe doing the final printout on our computer so no one would bring that up. But it's...
What was confusing, it says that it's for educational purposes only. but
Yeah. Yeah.
Are we getting educated?
Yes, I'm sure you are. It's not, I mean, we'd be happy to print it out on regular, with our regular program. But again, that was just because we just recently got a new computer in the office, and we haven't purchased the other license that we need to.
One more question, Mr. Chairman. Full basement, ledge, usually there's a lot of hydraulic activity in those kind of basements. Is there going to be floor drains?
Yes, building code would require that we put in a foundation drain, and that would typically be daylighted somewhere at a lower elevation, which would be towards the back
Well,
of
it
the
occurs
house.
to me the lower elevation is going to be well within the setback.
We've left enough room around that to be able, we're pretty much at grade when we come out of the house, maybe just a few inches below it.
Yeah, well, we don't, I only have this print. I don't even have a cross-sectional print. I don't know whether, did that,
The cross-section was actually attached to the application form. Do you have the application form, the revised application?
okay, I might, but is there going to be any fill to the rear of the property? In the absence of my ignorance of a cross-sectional plan?
It's on the very last page, Bill.
I don't think it's on.
It's small, 8 by 11, 8.5 by 11.
Try to see that.
No. So Stuart and I were just looking at the plan quickly. We do have room on the west side of the house. There's about 10 to 15 feet before you hit that setback area where we could daylight the foundation drain. We could add that to the plan so it's understood it's not to extend into the wetlands area, into the setback area. And also you should consider that that's a very small amount of water. It's water that's made its way through the ground already. It's not considered a direct discharge like water coming off of a driveway or something that might be
Our concern in the
contains some
past, though,
pollutants.
with floor drains being so close to a resource area is that, as you're, I'm sure, well aware, cellars tend to be a pretty big collection of materials, including paints, solvents, pesticides, and you name it. And in a flooded cellar, those get released rather quickly down the drain.
Well, this would be a foundation drain, so it wouldn't be connected directly to the inside of the house. It would just pick up moisture that hits the foundation wall, drops down. Yeah, it's a footing drain.
So you
Foundation
have
drain.
no, let me make it, I'm confused again. There is no floor drains inside the foundation.
No, and if I misled you, I'm sorry. I misunderstood the question. Normally, you don't have floor drains in a house, and I don't know why they would put one in this house. There's no need to, and we're not showing anything.
I just want to make, that's always a concern of us, because
Yeah.
if putting in, it's very easy in these types of locations where you have grade to go to light,
Right.
to add a floor drain.
Yeah, no, just a foundation drain. I'm sorry.
And they tend to be abused with, like, slop sinks and all the rest of those things. So, all right, absolutely no floor drain.
Sure, and you
On the
can make
record,
that
okay.
any kind of a condition of approval if you wanted to. House is not to have a internal floor and drain.
Another comment I had on the drainage plan, the curve number that was used in the calculations, was that based on the original condition of the site, so the entirely wooded condition of the site? Because I was trying to work through this, and the initial condition of the site was an entirely wooded property. All those trees are obviously going to do a good job of holding on to stormwater.
Right.
So I don't know if the curve number you used reflected that condition or the current disturbed condition of the site. And I'm not sure how that would change your calculations at all.
We used the curve number for wooded grass combination. I think that would be the typical for a wooded site in Connecticut, unless it were a very, very mature forest, 150, 200 years old, where you literally had no ground undergrowth or under canopy. That would be the correct designation to use. Yeah.
And also, I noticed that we only went up to the 10-year storm event. Would you be able to put in the calculations for a 25-year storm?
Yeah, we could do that very easily. For, again, a single-family residential development, 10-year would be typically what we look at. 25-year storm would be a little
Just
bigger, but we could do
Based on
that.
the sensitivity of the site and the
Right.
application itself, I think it would be nice if we could at least see the results of the calculations for the 25-year storm event?
We'll be happy to do that, and we'll print it out on the, with the correct licensed software, so you don't get that error message again. So just for the record, we will print out the 25-year analysis, and we will print it out on the licensed software that we have in the office.
Okay, and I don't know if the cross-sectional plan was created by you or Stuart, but it would be nice if I could have a large-scale cross-sectional plan with the appropriate scale, bar, and seal, etc. This is the only thing I received.
I thought it was submitted.
Wasn't it? I'm sorry, but I thought it was already submitted.
I didn't see the large-scale plan, the large-scale section.
It was part of the roll-up. Oh. To answer your question, I'll have it on your desk
I'm
tomorrow.
sorry. I mean, maybe it's mixed up in my other sets, but I don't think so.
Right, it has the full title block on it, scale, everything.
I didn't see it.
Okay.
I'll look through this. All right.
You don't see it?
No.
All right, well, it will be submitted to you tomorrow morning. You're looking for the full scale of the cut-down versions that you have?
Correct.
Okay. But you do have the cut-down versions?
I have the 8.5 by 11.
By 11, okay. If there are no other questions at this time, we conclude our presentation. And Chief, we will obviously stay here. If there's any further questions, please feel free to call upon us, and we reserve the right to rebut as usual. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
You have to speaking.
We have an intervener. Are they represented?
Good evening.
Excuse me.
I'm sorry.
Would it be all right if we take a 2-minute recess?
Oh, yeah, sure.
2 minutes.
The clock is running. No pressure, the clock is running.
You're in these chairs all the time. When I see you at
I know, I'm gonna start signing more drafts.
I see it at the planning meeting, you gotta get up and walk around. Otherwise, bro, I'm not gonna be able to get you up.
I know.
Hey, I know what it's like. When the bones start to settle, they don't wanna move it. Trust me.
You know, before we had somebody do a couple of these things, and she backed out. Like I said, it's like, so you're always picking me up at the nursing home to come here. I know.
You're right. Everything, camera gets everything. Gotta be
activity was going to be, and then if they're going to do this.
I'd like to call the meeting back to order.
Wait for John, go ahead, bud.
Start well.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Are we missing someone?
He's here.
Okay. Okay. Madam Secretary, members of the Commission, and Ms. Batto, good evening. My name is Edward Schofield. I've lived in this town my entire life, and I've lived at Butternut Lane since 1997. And I think it's important to understand the background, and I apologize in advance for what may be a slightly prolix presentation, maybe more so than you're used to from an intervener, but I'll try to keep it organized. You already have, I believe, Ms. Batto, I hope, has distributed our notice of intervention. The notice of intervention includes what would be some of my testimony, which relates to prior proceedings before this commission that began back in, essentially, if we consider the staff as part of that process, April of last year. So I'm going to avoid repeating myself because I hope that can be accepted as it's a sworn statement as part of my presentation today. I don't want to belabor the record by reviewing all of those factual details.
Absolutely. I read through your intervention petition, and everything was spot on.
Okay. Thank you. I do have a few points of background to address some of the issues that were raised today, and in a few moments I'll introduce Mr. Danzer, who will have some comments about scientific things that I really don't understand and obviously have relied upon him for in terms of some of the issues that are raised today. I'm privileged to have with me today some fellow members of an organization we formed just in the last 10 days, Friends of Pumpkin Ground Brook, Inc., which is simply our way of saying that we've got a group of neighbors and other citizens of Stratford who have a great concern about this particular application/violation. It's important to note that what brings us here today is, I think, a somewhat unusual procedure. I went over the last 10 years of this commission's meeting minutes and didn't see... if I saw more than one or two of instances like this, it was a lot. I didn't see this particular approach taken often, particularly not with a violation of this magnitude. So I think one of the themes you'll hear us urging today is going to be very similar. It's probably pretty predictable. It's going to be that we prefer Ms. Batto's option number one. And option number one, in our view, is that this property needs to be restored. We're exactly 1 year to the day from the day that this property was clear-cut, and we are nowhere. This needs to get going now. We missed the spring season of last year. We missed the fall season of last year, and much to Ms. Batto's chagrin, I know, because the applicant approached, as is reflected in my papers, in the intervention papers, the applicant talked about coming back to this commission in September of last year, failed completely to do so. And now here we are in March, met with not just the restoration plan, but a plan to develop the property. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, and how those two plans really don't mesh at this stage. The disruption attendant the construction is going to be entirely inconsistent with the restoration plan. And I think that and we'll have testimony obviously from Mr. Danzer on this, but it's going to be important to get stabilization of this property. And by the way, and I'll talk about this in a moment, and I'm reluctant to do so, but I feel I have to, the bona fides of this applicant violator needs to be demonstrated to this commission and to this town. We need to see concretely evidence that there's going to be compliance with this commission's order about restoration before there's any consideration of an application to build. In that regard, I'm going to start by, I wrote down a few notes as I heard the presentation this evening. And by the way, to Mr. Sachs's credit, he seems to be a very well-credentialed individual in this field. And if you look at the planting plan, there are some nice plants and ideas on it. But it's a poignant thing. I was struck as I listened to his presentation. As well-meaning as it might have been, I heard about things like, well, in 20 to 25 years, we're going to have some really nice-looking trees back there. Well, guess what? A year ago today, we had trees that were, the trees that he describes, by the way. If you read his report, he's very candid in his narrative report, where he talks about the beech and the oak and the maple that were lost. Trees that, this has been my backyard or in my backyard for 20 years. Trees that were 50 feet tall, 40, 50 feet tall. These are mature trees, and it's a tragedy of the first magnitude from an environmental standpoint. We heard, in fact, on that score, Mr. Sachs said, well, I wish I had met Mr. Hirsch 6 months ago. Well, that would have been October. Guess what? That wouldn't have done anything. I wish I had met him 8 months ago. Well, that would have been August. Again, all the trees would have been gone. He needed to meet him 13 months ago to stop this from happening. But guess what? There's somebody in this room who met Mr. Hirsch in time to stop this travesty, and that's me. On the date of the presidential primary, this is very vivid in my mind, that was April 26, 2016. It was a Tuesday. My son was home from college to vote in the primary. Came home from Chapel Street School. It was about 3 in the afternoon. My son Charlie, who was home, said, hey, there's something going on in the backyard. The guys are taking down some trees. So I walked back, and I introduced myself to Mr. Hirsch. Now, again, I hesitate to do this. Mr. Hirsch, we heard him apologize today. First, I've heard it. It took a year, but I heard an apology today. I question, respectfully, given the setting of this hearing, where he's seeking application from this commission to build a home, the sincerity and genuineness of this apology, since it came a year too late. Because the following fact is important to remember. On that day, I had a conversation with Mr. Hirsch that went along these lines. I introduced myself. He introduced himself. I said to Mr. Hirsch, what are you doing back here? He informed me that he had purchased the property. And I said, well, what are you up to? He said, I'm clearing it to build a home. I'm going to build a little 1,600-foot bungalow, as he described it to me, and I want to be a good neighbor. And I said, respectfully, Brian, as far as I know, this is not a buildable lot. We've been told, because back when I bought the house, I went and talked to zoning, and actually I had, heard this. I think Paula Malika, and she'll speak, I'm sure, on her own behalf tonight, had talked to the building folks within a week or so prior to my meeting with Mr. Hirsch, because she saw some activity back there. She wanted to know, can this be built? And we had always assumed it couldn't be built. In fact, the record will show, this is a matter of public record on the town of Stratford's land records, Mr. Hirsch paid $20,000 for the lot. Again, perhaps I wouldn't mention that if we didn't have this claim of hardship now.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, excuse me. I'm going to object to this form of presentation. What we are here for this evening is to correct a problem. The commission, no disrespect to Mr. Schofield, he's quite a gentleman. This is not getting us to the objections or the concerns that have to do with our presentation on restoring a plan based on something that we already admit was wrong. We know it's wrong. This is going backward, not forward. And I intend no disrespect to Mr. Schofield. He's a gentleman. But I would like to see, respectfully, Mr. Chairman, that this thing move forward and not go into all of the damage that we all know was done and how long it took us to get here. We're here. We're here to correct a problem that should have never have happened in the first place. And I thank you, and I don't mean to be...
May I be heard on the legal admissibility of what I'm saying?
I think he's going too far.
We're here on a joint application. This committee combined the violation and the permit. The violation requires that this committee adjudicate Mr. Hirsch's behavior, the applicant's behavior. And what I'm about to testify to, and I understand why Mr. Owen interrupted me, because he knows exactly what I'm going to tell him, what I'm going to tell this commission, because I told it to him on the phone when he called me the other day. And he said, well, I'm going to object to that. And here's why. Because what I'm going to say is that I told Mr. Hirsch the lot could not be built on, and I said, you better check with the town first before you do anything else. His comment to me was, I've already talked to the town, I'm good to go. He said those words, I'm good to go. This violator willfully proceeded to clear-cut land, even though he is a landscape architect. And he did so because he knew that it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. How did he know that there were wetlands? He told me he had put in the foundation himself back at 320 Whippoorwill some years earlier. And he said he was very familiar with the land. We know he's a landscape architect of some 25 years' experience. He made that assurance to me, and by the way, I took him at his word. I scratched my head and said, boy, that's a big surprise to me. I went down the next morning and spoke to John Rosatsky. First I started with Brian in building. And I said to Brian, I said, is this lot a buildable? That's not a buildable lot. That has major zoning problems. I confirmed the same with Rosatsky the same morning. But they told me, well, you know what? It's his land. He can still cut the trees down from it. What we didn't realize at the time, until he started going down on Thursday, that's the 28th of April, down toward the pond, that it occurred to, I can't take credit for this, my wife said, gee, Ed, he's going down near the pond. Isn't that a wetland? And sure enough, I called John Rosatsky, and on Friday morning, early Friday morning, John came right up, took one look at this property, and said, this is outrageous. This man knew what he was doing. He went out and he slapped the stickers, the violation stickers, on the equipment that day. So the idea that we're here on a mistake is frankly an offensive mistruth that's being promulgated by Mr. Owen and by Mr. Hirsch. And it should not be countenanced because it's a critical element in your evaluation of the violation to consider whether the applicant acted willfully, and he did. The question about these years, 15 years, 20 years, all that does is drives home the gravity of this harm. We can't fix it. Nobody can fix it. No human being can fix the fact that there's been this devastation. Mr. Sachs has a plan to remediate. It's offered in good faith, and 10, 20, 25 years from now, it'll look lovely. But in the meantime, we're going to have some 6-foot trees and 8-foot trees where there have been 20 and 30-foot trees. And by the way, not just for their aesthetic value, as this commission knows within its jurisdiction, the stabilization of those trees, as the members of this commission have commented tonight, as well as the canopy, the tree canopy for the wetlands. I'll show photographs in a few moments of stumps, tree cutting right near the wetlands, outside the scope of the silt fence, right down near the wetlands. So there's no question that there's been significant damage done to the canopy. There was a question about the idea that there's with this house proposal, and I think the record's clear that our group and myself and other abutters oppose the granting of any permit at this stage. It's premature. We need restoration first. It sounds like Mr. Sachs, from his own testimony, spoke about a 3-year period. Well, that ought to occur. And I think that's, if anything, that's a conservative period. Mr. Danzer will address that in a few moments. On the undue hardship issue, again, I don't think it's even a cognizable issue before this commission, but if it were, as I mentioned, the applicant did not purchase the lot for the price of what would customarily be, and this panel is entitled to take judicial notice or notice of these facts, what would be a building lot for 1 acre in North Stratford. So the trade-off on the house, of course, is they're talking about, well, we had to move it a little closer to the wetlands so that we could accommodate the septic. Well, guess what? Some lots can't be built. They can't be built. There are lots that, because of the wetlands, you can't squeeze in a lot without damaging the wetlands, a resource of this town. This we submit is one of those lots. And that's why this commission should order restoration, because that's a completely independent question of whether this is a buildable lot or not. The property's been destroyed in violation of the wetlands regulations. It's regulated activity. It needs to be fixed. Only then can they come back and say, hey, now we have an application. The soil's been stabilized. Maybe the panel will look favorably on it. At this time, with the panel's indulgence, I'd like to distribute. We have exhibits that we're going to be offering, including Mr. Danzer's report. I have binders for every member of the group here, and of course for the violator applicant as well. The green book is the original, and then we've got.
I walk in the room. You know, let's cut to the chase here.
Just want to make reference to it.
So the binder I've presented, members of the commission, starts with a list of exhibits. And what I propose to do, and as a way of just presenting this as expeditiously as we can, is to just go through them in order, tell you what you're looking at there, and then obviously we're going to get to Mr. Danzer's report as one of these exhibits, and at that time I'd ask him to address the commission. The first exhibit is a screenshot that was taken from the internet. It's a picture from Google Earth or Google Maps, and this is true of the second exhibit as well. And those are aerial representations, aerial photographs of the area. And you can see that the circle, if you look at it sort of oriented in this manner, you're looking at Butternut Lane in the foreground. And the house that's quite prominent there to the right part, that's at 160 Butternut, which is the home of the Malikas. And then the one just to the left of it, where you can just see a portion of the roof, that's my house at 140. And you have to look down. I think 110 may be completely obscured by trees. If you look up at the very top of the picture in the center, that's 320 Whippoorwill. Okay? And then you look at that home in the left that stands out, that's at River Valley Road. That's the abutter at the very end of River Valley. If you look at the central area, the area kind of between the Butternut houses and the Whippoorwill house in the River Valley area, what you see is essentially a forest. And that's confirmed if you look at this is a bit of an oblique view, but if you look at Exhibit 2, which is a direct overhead aerial, again, if you orient yourself the same way, you see the Malika's home is on the G of Google, is right on the Malika's garage. And if you go one to the left, that's my house. And you go one further to the left, that's the home of Jill Perkins and Merritt Sonner, formerly the home of Barb and Norm Aldrich. Barb is here with us today. If you go from there to the north again, you can orient with the River Valley home on the left, and in the upper middle, the 320 Whippoorwill home, and in the center, you see forest. I'd like to draw your attention now, if I may, members of the Commission, to Exhibit 3. Exhibit 3 was downloaded from a company called TerraServer, and what it shows is, again, the same orientation. It's a slightly different season. It's obviously, it's not the height of the growing season, but nonetheless, it was taken according to the site, and I have the documentation for this. The date of it was, coincidentally, April 28th, 2016, which was the very day when the clear cutting was completed, 1 year ago tomorrow. And what you see now in the place of forest, in that gap among those 5 houses I've been talking about with respect to Exhibits 1 and 2, is a very stark appearance of complete denuding of the landscape. In the right center, you'll see a very bright color. I would represent to you that I believe from my memory of looking at it that those are wood chips from the chipping that was done back at that time. So this orients us quite well to the difference before and after of the effects of the devastation that occurred back 1 year ago this week. Drawing your attention to Exhibits 4 and 5, those are photographs that were taken from my backyard and they illustrate, the house you see in the background is at 320 Whippoorwill. So we're looking kind of across the property from my yard back to 320. And that was taken that same week during the clear cutting, and it shows obviously some equipment and fallen logs, and it shows the absence of those magnificent trees that are laying prone on the ground. And then again, the next one, number 5, depicts from a slightly different angle, looking more toward Whippoorwill Lane. You can see, again, some of the evidence of the trees that were taken down. And by the way, there was something in Mr. Sachs' report, I believe. He mentioned 15 mature trees. Having lived there for 20 years, I can tell you there had to be way more. And I think if you went out and counted the stumps, somebody would actually counted them. I'm not sure what the formal definition of mature is, but there were many trees there as reflected by Exhibits 1 and 2.
Can I stop you just for a second? I was actually out there today, and I looked at the piles of logs that still remained. There had to be at least 24, if not more. So I do agree with that.
Thank you. No, it just struck me as a very low number when I first heard it. Now, if I can bring your attention now to Exhibits 6 and 7. And we have a blow-up, I think, of 7, because I think it's a good illustration. Was this easel the property of the applicant? Don't mind? Thank you so much. Mr. Sachs intuitively recognizes my lack of mechanical ability. Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, what we see in 6 and 7 is a view that was taken on or about May 13th. That was the day that Steve Danzer came to the property at the request of the abutting landowners to examine it. And we went down, and I realize now that we were standing, I think on reflection, I think we were actually standing in the applicant violator's property. It's possible, so I apologize for that. But anyway, you can see it's taken from the perspective of the wetlands, looking upslope. 6 looks up sort of toward the 320 Whippoorwill home in that direction, and 7, the one you have on the easel there, portrays quite vividly, I think, a couple things. One, it shows the sort of stark difference between the tree line that borders, that's on my property, to the right side of the picture, to the barren landscape to the left. And the silt fence, obviously, you'll see that since we're standing down near the wetland, pretty close to it, you'll see there's some stumps that were cut quite close to the wetland area, which confirms the suggestion I made earlier that the canopy was quite clearly damaged. Drawing your attention to the next exhibit in the sequence, it's Exhibit 8. That's taken from the backyard at 110 Butternut, and that was taken just last week, by the way. And that looks out over the kind of pond or swamp portion of the wetland up toward, you can just barely discern the silt fence on the other side of the pond there. So that's looking up toward the property at 350 Whippoorwill from the backyard at 110. Just to give the folks an idea, if you haven't seen the property before, haven't walked it, that the wetland, sometimes there's a wetland, you don't even know it's a wetland. This one's a pond that is, every spring, we would reliably hear the frogs and the ducks making use of that pond. It's an actual habitat for wildlife. There's no question about it. I've spoken to a few of my neighbors, and the consensus is, and this is not scientific, is that we haven't heard the frogs and ducks that much this year. But I can't put any weight in it. I don't know what effects. Maybe we won't know for some time what affects this devastation of the property to allow all that runoff into the pond area, the swamp area, is going to have on the habitat. We just don't know, I suppose, and I guess it would be speculation, but it's certainly not a good effect. I'd like to draw your attention, if I may, to Exhibit 9. Exhibit 9 is, again, a screenshot, and what that relates to is there was a property listing for this property on a very common real estate website known as Trulia. It's used to advertise property for sale. I had shared this information before with the staff some time ago at her request. when I mentioned it to her. This document is part of the website. If you went to look at the 350 Whippoorwill listing, this was one of the couple pictures that were up there. And why is it significant? Well, it's significant because it purports to be some type of a survey-type map, and it has a circle in blue ink around the subject property. You'll see, if you look to the left of that, you'll see Butternut Lane. That'll orient.
You hold up for a minute?
Yes, of course.
I've got to get a whole new tape. This might take a few minutes to open this.
You got another tape we'd have to.
Yeah, no, this is it though, so. These tapes are. They don't even seem like they last as long as the others. Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yes, so Exhibit 9, as I was saying, a real estate website, the listing had a couple of photographs. One of them was this document, which is an image of a map. The 1.12 is the acreage. I think the panel will note from the testimony already offered by the applicant violator. And 82 is the designation of that property on the assessor's map. So, of course, what I'd like to draw your attention to is the squiggly line in the corner of the property and the clear delineation. If you look at the little symbol, the sort of universal symbol, the blue line runs through it once, but you'll see it at the very, very top also, the wetlands symbol. My point being, it's just one other bit of evidence that would have put a purchaser of this property on notice that there was at least something to look into, particularly if your profession is landscape architecture or excavation. Drawing your attention now, if I may, to Exhibits 10 and 11. These two documents are offered. These photographs were taken in the April of 2016 timeframe. And you'll see there was some blue in both pictures. In the first one, you see one blue flag, and in the second, you see two blue flags. And the point being that there's the property was flagged at the time of the clear cutting. Now, we know it wasn't flagged for wetlands because the testimony is that Mr. Hirsch didn't know about wetlands, although obviously that's disputed. So it could, presumably, and we can hear perhaps testimony from the applicant about this, presumably it was flagged for property border. That would be a logical assumption. If so, the photograph illustrates the second one in the sequence, that if you draw sort of a mental line between those two blue flags, you can see that there are stumps cut on both sides of the line. So if it is a property boundary, and I don't know that, but it would suggest to me that either there's cutting across the boundaries, or because this area is down by the wetland, it's clear that there's even more cutting than was illustrated before in the vicinity of the wetlands. The next exhibit in sequence brings us to my distinguished guest, Stephen Danzer. So I'm going to ask that, with the Commission's indulgence, that I be interrupted. I do have some more documents, but in the meantime, I've got him here. I'd like him to address the Commission with his expertise and take any questions.
Good evening. I honestly didn't expect to get on this particular second. I thought we were going to get to the end of the exhibits, but that's okay. For the record, my name is Stephen Danzer. I'm the principal of my environmental firm, Steve Danzer and Associates, office in Stratford, Connecticut. I'm a soil scientist. I'm a professional wetland scientist. I'm a Connecticut licensed arborist. Some of you, or many of you, might remember me back in my days of over 10 years ago when I was environmental planner on behalf of the town. In any case, my involvement with this region, this neighborhood, actually dates back to 2015, May 18th, 2015, when I delineated a wetland, I believe 2 properties away. that copy of that delineation is actually in your packet as the next exhibit, just for the record. So that was back in May 18th, 2015. I went back in the gentleman's backyard. There was a red maple swamp. It was shared between him and a few of his neighbors. I delineated his portion of it. I stopped at what appeared to be the property boundary at the time. I didn't give much thought to where that swamp went in relation to his neighbors other than the information I needed to do that delineation. I left the property and essentially took my fee, wrote him the report, and that was the end of my interaction for the moment with him until sometime later, about a year later, when I received the phone call. Apparently, as you all know, there was a neighbor that clear-cut their lot, and apparently, because the clear-cut was adjacent to a wetland, and turned out that wetland was the wetland that I had delineated a portion of the year before. So I was asked to come out and just give them my thoughts about the nature of the activity that had transpired. They were very concerned about what the impact of the wetlands are, not necessarily just the wetlands on the property of the site that got cleared, but the rest of the wetlands as well. My feeling, and became very evident, that the neighbors were trying to be good stewards of their wetlands. They valued it a lot. It was very aesthetically a pleasing open space, rear of their backyards. They really had, for one thing, they had a concern that the upland was cleared, but their emphasis was on the wetlands. So I give them my thoughts. Unfortunately, I have a lot of experience in these matters from my municipal experience with the town of Stratford, but of since then with many other experiences on behalf of several municipalities and also representing the other side of the fence, people who have willfully or accidentally done activities similar to this. So I'm very familiar with restoration plans. So what I told my clients at the time was two things. One thing, I gave them a quick assessment of what I thought was going on with the wetland, and I'll get to that in a moment. And the second thing I said, well, it's obviously it's going to be incumbent upon the commission to ask them to come forward with a restoration plan, and when they come forward with the restoration plan, we can take a look at it, and I can make some comments, some constructive criticisms, or some criticisms that are a little bit more insightful, depending on the nature of what they come back for. And being that I've done this type of work, I was under no illusion that someone was going to come back the next day to give a planting plan. But after going in and talking to the zoning officer, because I believe our wetland officer was on leave at the time, so I talked to the zoning officer, Mr. Rusatsky, who was filling in at the time, and he made it clear that he sent out a notice of violation, and I had no reason to believe that, maybe not in a matter of days, but in a matter of weeks, or certainly within a month or two, this issue would be on its way to resolution, and obviously it wasn't, and that's why we're here today. Okay, so anyway, to get to the bulk of my comments, I have 4 sections. 2 of them I'm going to go through briefly, and I'm going to spend most of my time on the latter 2. My first section, which is labeled Wetland Impacts Due to the Unauthorized Activities, I wrote that up primarily to offer to the Commission. I think the Commission already knows this. I had to put it on record to support the intervention, so it's basically my technical opinion in support of the intervention to allow Mr. Schofield to intervene. But essentially what it says is I went out there, observed the damage a couple of days or a couple of weeks after it had occurred. There were 3 impacts that I saw. There was an impact to the wetland hydrology because they clear-cut the slope, created more runoff. There was some sedimentation into the wetlands that I observed. And 3, there was, because the vegetation was removed, the large overstory vegetation, the area was open to sunlight. And there was testimony before from Mr. Sachs that, sunlight might not be such a bad thing in a forest floor because it opens up the forest to new species. And whether I agree or disagree, I think the point is the question at hand is what is the impact on the wetlands, not necessarily on the uplands. And the impact of the wetlands when you open up a wetland to sunlight is that it encourages the growth of less desirable species often. So it's not necessarily a positive impact. So those were the 3 impacts. I qualified them. We wrote a full page on them for anyone to review at their leisure after the public hearing closes or during the consideration phase. The The conclusion of that section was the activity, which was, everyone agrees, was unauthorized, qualifies as a significant impact as per the town of Stratford wetland regulations. The second section is cuts to the meat of the matter, which is the question, the nature of the compliance issue. And I was heartened to see that, irrespective of what my opinion is, it seemed to me that there was more than one or two or three commissioners who kind of think the same way that I think on this. So I don't think there's a lot of difference in opinion as far as how to handle this compliance issue. I think we might respectfully disagree in the details, but I think we all agree that the restoration needs to happen before the development of the house. How that happens, my opinion would be that you would separate these out as two applications. I think there's a legal argument, clear precedent, maybe not in this town, but in my experience with other compliance issues, to separate them out. However, if you choose to keep the resolution of the violation as part of the permit, and I will not opine whether or not, well, my opinion is that I think you should not do that, but I won't opine on the legality if you choose to do that. I think there was some good conversation that went back and forth about the staging. Again, I think everyone agreed that the restoration should happen before they break ground for the excavation for the residents. I'm in agreement of that, but everyone's assuming that this house is going to be built, and that bothers me. It bothers me for a couple of reasons. One is, as was testified here, there's a question of whether or not this meets zoning, and our view or my view is that's beyond my scope of review. I don't care about that, and I don't think the Commission necessarily cares about that. But it's a reality that if they run into issues on the other side, whether they're municipal related, whether they don't meet health code, whether they don't meet zoning or financing drops out or ownership problems, change of titles, bankruptcy, all these things that are beyond the purview of our Commission that frankly I don't care about and probably you don't or shouldn't care about, they are a potential and they could happen. If that happens, this permit, if you grant it, never gets activated. If this permit doesn't get activated, then there's no restoration plan. So again, I understand the importance of the sequencing, that we should somehow sequence this if a permit is issued, that this work is done prior to the residents. But again, I think we need to worry if this permit is approved but never activated. So my way out of that is to issue a recommendation, and I'm going to read it very slowly so it gets into the record. And I'll conclude that part before I say that. For these reasons, there are no practical guarantees that the permit will ever be activated and the restoration plan implemented. As such, it is strongly recommended that if the Commission incorporates the restoration plan into the same application to develop the residence, that any such permit, if approved, be conditioned to mandate that the restoration plan aspect of the approved activities be implemented within 3 months, winter notwithstanding. So in other words, if for some bizarre reason this stretches out into January and there's snow on the ground and you issue an approval, we don't expect them to implement the restoration plan in February. Anyway, implemented within 3 months of any permit approval, and that failure to satisfy this permit condition under such timeline will absolutely result in the immediate revocation of the permit. So in other words, if you do issue a permit, if everyone comes to agreement that you're happy with whatever the house location is and that you're happy with the staging and all that, and the permit gets approved and nothing happens within 3 months, that the penalty for violating that permit condition is immediately revocation of the permit. So along with the issuance of a new cease and desist order so we can start the process again. So again, my recommendation is to separate the issues, to act on this independently, the restoration plan independently, and not tie this up with the permit. But if you do choose to do that, and I can understand why you have reasons to do that, that you basically put some appropriate permit condition, whether it's my language or something close to it, but to put a suitable remedy, because there's no assurance that this permit will ever be activated. And I think that's the problem that we had within the last year, was there was a hope that they were going to come forward with a permit application, or that the builder would do exactly what they're doing now, but they were going to come forward 2 months after the clear cutting, and it never happened. And, whether or not there was follow-up on the town, I'm not going to get into that. I know Mr. Schofield documented some of that in his exhibits, but the reality is that nothing had happened. So I want to make sure that we don't lose momentum here and that this site continues to get the scrutiny that it deserves. All right. I'm going to change gears a little bit. I evaluated the planting plan. I thought overall it wasn't a bad plan, to be totally honest. Not that I had any pre-bias when I looked at it. I'll be honest, I've never seen one of Mr. Sachs or Stewart before. I didn't know what to think. It really wasn't a bad plan. However, I do have some important points, what I term constructive criticism, that I'd like to share with the Commission, because minimally, I think if you're giving serious consideration to the planting plan, then I think there's some areas that need to be shored up. The first item, the question about the maintenance plan, which is proposed from 3 years, it should be 5 years, for a number of reasons. For one thing, this is a high-risk project, both environmentally and situationally. Situationally, again, with the nature of the violation, but environmentally because we're dealing with slopes close to the wetlands. My familiarity with this type of work is that usually for this type of situation, 5 years is not too burdensome to do that. If this was an Army Corps permit, I know this is not an Army Corps permit, this is not a federal permit project, but the Army Corps actually stipulates 10 years. And then in all honesty, sometimes you do negotiate down, but when you negotiate down minimally or maximally, it gets negotiated down to 5 years. So I think 5 years, if you're looking for a magic number, is the more appropriate time to extend the maintenance and management plan out. Second point, I don't know if you do this normally in your permits here. It's something you probably should, and you definitely need to do it here, but you need to set a performance standard regarding the survivability of the planting stock. Even in my experience, the best wetland plantings, 10 to 12% mortality is natural, even, because you're basically fighting Mother Nature. So you want to make sure at the end of whatever period you're monitoring that you have enough planting stocks. So what I propose is 90%, and I didn't write it here, but what that means is that every year that you monitor, you count the plants. You can do either plant number or plant cover, but you essentially inventory what you have. If you have more than 10% mortality, you add extra plants to reach that number. You do that year 1, you do that year 2, you do that year 3, you do that year 4, you do that year 5. So theoretically speaking, in year 5, if you have 15% mortality, you're still adding plants at that point. Point number 3, kind of a minor point, but kind of not so much of a minor point. There are 2 trees depicted on the planting plan on the slope that don't have species labels. A better man than me would probably go to the planting table and calculate from the number of quantities what those plants were. I didn't do that. I didn't feel I needed to do that. I think I do understand that this plan was vetted through 2 other landscape architects, but there are, again, we have plants on the slope that everyone's concerned with, and 2 of them don't have labels. I don't know what they are. But anyway, that's obviously the landscape architect had an idea of what they are, and I think that's an easy thing for him to revise in any final submission. Point D, technical note, they put 50-foot setback. As you know, we don't have setbacks, we have upland review areas. I can understand what they're saying. What they're saying is the house is 54.6 feet set back from the wetlands. Technically, they're probably correct. But I do think the nature of the situation and the fact that this controversy may or may not end tonight, that there should be some effort to have the application materials as accurate as possible and in conformance with the regulatory language. So what they need to do is revise those 2 plans to say 250 feet upland review area. I noticed in the narrative they did say 250 feet. It just never transcribed to the plans. 4th point. The oak and red maples, which are important components of the plan, are proposed at 1 to 1.5 inch caliper. If you're in someone's backyard and you're doing a wetland enhancement as part of mitigation and not as a compliance, 1 to 1.5 inch caliper is totally appropriate. This is not that situation. This is a compliance, in other words, a violation. We're trying to restore functions to that area that we're taking away rather dramatically. The functions that we're restoring are all, to be redundant, are a function of canopy cover. The way to reestablish canopy cover is basically planting the largest tree that is economically appropriate. And the easy fix to that is to basically change the 1 to 1.5 inch size caliper to 2 to 5 inch caliper, because it has a slightly larger canopy, and therefore will restore those functions of that area quicker. Again, if you talk to, I'm sure our landscape architect admits, a 2 to 2.5 is not burdensome to inflict. If we were asking for 4 inch or 5 inch, those are really thick trees. But we spec on my plans to 2.2 to 2.5. Actually, we're working on one right now. We're speccing 2.5 to 3 routinely. I don't see any reason why they couldn't do that. And finally, I didn't see anything in the plans that talked about irrigation. Some years you don't worry about it. Some years, like last year, you do worry about that. So that's an easy fix. They need to elaborate as to their source of irrigation. That becomes especially important if they implement this planting plan before they develop the residence, or even, let's just say, at worst case, while they're developing the residence, because there's going to be no source of water. So where's that water coming from? I mean, I can envision a couple of sources, but it's up to them to figure out. So, again, imagine that there's no work being done on that property except for implementation of the plan. They need to explain where they're going to get the water to irrigate if irrigation becomes necessary if we enter another drought cycle. All right, that was the easy part. Those are constructive criticisms. I'd like to kind of finish with some comments about the location of the residence. I believe that you should move the location of the residence minimally back another 30 feet. And I went through the reasons why. And basically, what it boils down to is that there's a slope that goes down to the wetland. They've moved the house not to the top of the slope, but where the slope comes down. They've changed the hydrology to the wetlands. By their own report, which was calculated for a 10-year flood, there's a 35% reduction in flow towards the wetlands post-development. And as I say, to quote my report, this represents a substantial diminishment of flow to the wetlands, considering that, as noted earlier, the wetland in this area depends solely upon overland sheet flow and infiltrated seepage rather than stream conveyance for hydration. So in other words, that wetland in that area, what sustains that wetlands is rain that previously landed on trees that got intercepted by the leaves, which are no longer there. But before they did all that manipulation, that water would make its way down the slope, infiltrate, meter out fairly slowly, sustain that wetlands over time. Then they clear cut, so now what you have is accelerated runoff. So the good news is that the wetland hydrates, and it probably hydrates a little bit more. The bad news is that it doesn't stay hydrated as long, because it's like feeding sugar to a person. You're basically giving water quicker instead of metering it out slower. Now you're putting a house on it, and you're not even sending all the water that is going there now into that wetland. So again, 35% is being diverted elsewhere. So that is a hydrologic effect on the wetland. You can avoid that by pulling the house off the slope and leaving the integrity of the watershed as is. On top of that, there's other benefits. You have a larger wetland buffer width. You have less opportunity for the sunlight to intrude into the wetlands. You totally avoid the removal of bedrock because, as someone pointed out, there's the house right now is positioned between two bedrock outcrops, one which doesn't look like they're touching, but the other one looks like they are chipping or removing. If they move the house back up, they totally avoid having to do that. And of course, there's less opportunity for erosion. One thing I will say is that if you do listen to my suggestion, or you move the house back, whatever your own magic number for your own comfort is, make sure they expand their planting plan to fill that area. Don't forget about that. And if there's going to be a conservation easement, make sure that extends over that area. I think the logical thing to do, considering that the entire lot to work with, considering that they cleared the lot, so now no one can argue that trees are a constraint anywhere on that lot. I think the logical solution is to move it out of the zone of influence to the wetlands, which would be the top of the hill, which is elevation 90 according to their plans, which is approximately 30 feet farther back from where it is right now. So that's my opinion, and I'm here for if you have any questions, comments. I bore you?
No questions?
All right.
Members of the Commission, thank you. I'd like to draw your attention. Obviously, you have Exhibits 12 through 14 that comprise Mr. Danzer's 2 reports and his curriculum vitae. And now in Exhibit 15, the Notice of Intervention, the Commission's also already indicated that it has accepted that as in lieu of testimony. I won't belabor the points reflected in Exhibit 15. In 16, we just have a copy. I'm sure you have records of this, obviously, in the Commission's file, but just to get the date set, April 29th, of course, the date of the letter to Mr. Rosotsky sent to Ms. Wolf. And then, of course, in 17, that was the product of that first meeting, reflected in the minutes, the May 18th meeting, where this Commission ordered the restoration plan for the first time, approximately 11 months ago. Finally, in Exhibit 18, on that same subject, what I've done there is I just took all of the minutes and agendas from that time period and highlighted the occasions when this matter appeared before the Commission, just for ease of reference. And obviously, those references were made in the body of the Notice of Intervention. In Exhibit 19, I just took a copy of the applicant violator's soil map, just to show, this relates sort of to those photographs I showed a few moments ago about the trees that were cut down near the border of the wetlands, and just to show that it's suggested that somewhere, and I don't remember exactly where, that there was no work done in the wetlands, but I think that's not clear. It seems since this is 10% of the property, the wetlands, 5,000 square feet out of approximately 50,000, and that area is reflected by the photographs, including Exhibit 7 with the stumps that were cut quite clearly outside the silt fence area, that would appear to actually be within the zone reflected in that number 3 here on Exhibit 19 from the soil scientist retained by the applicant violator. Exhibit 20 is, and I know that time is short tonight, and we have a 40-second video of from that week in April. I didn't bring a screen and projector because I know that, but I'm submitting that DVD. I'd like to offer it. I've provided a copy of the other side. All it is a photograph taken by my wife from our back deck that week of April. It shows the heavy equipment moving around with the logs, just to give the panel an idea of the impact. It's quite visceral to see it in a video. In Exhibit 21, we have just an indication. I don't think this is a disputed fact. I'll be brief on this. As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Hirsch identified himself as someone who had done that foundation back at 320. He's a professional excavator and landscape contractor. And that leads me to pose a question. I know I have rights of cross-examination. I don't want to exercise those today if I don't need to, but I would like to question pose, perhaps by the Commission, to the applicant violator, which is, if you look at the plan, and I'd ask you to look at it very closely, the planting plan of Mr. Sachs, it's very clear that he's giving very specific direction to the contractor who's going to be executing this plan. It's absolutely pivotal to the success of the restoration that the contractor who's doing the landscape work be scrupulous in carrying out each step of it during whether it's a 3-year period or 5-year period. And I think it's fair in this question to ask whether it's proposed that landscape contractor who's going to be doing this work is to be Mr. Hirsch or not, or one of his companies. So I'd like to pose that question. I'll pose it. I would insist that I be allowed to pose it, or I'd ask the Commission to pose it. Can we have an answer to that question, Mr. Owen?
If it's the Commission's desire that Mr. Hirsch hire an independent landscape contractor to plant the shrubbery and do the restoration, we have no objection to that whatsoever.
And the concern wouldn't be just the planting, of course, but the maintenance, which is specified quite clearly by Mr. Sachs's planting report. Exhibit 22, again, not really disputed, I guess. This was one of the advertisements from Mr. Hirsch's company. It indicates on the second page some of his skills, landscape design and construction and so forth. More recently, his LinkedIn profile at Exhibit 23, construction management, residential homes, and so forth. Exhibit 24, and I redacted this document very carefully to avoid any embarrassment or anything, but I think it's important on the question of bond, the bond that this commission needs to consider, to notice that in Mr. Hirsch's bankruptcy in 2010...
Excuse me. I don't think that's germane.
Okay,
this is the Inland Wetlands Commission. We're going to get a bond.
We'll get a bond,
The
okay.
bond's going to be certified.
Okay, that's fine. Okay,
We're not interested in this stuff.
That's
This
fair.
is not
Okay, that's fine.
the Better Business Bureau.
That's fine. Draw your attention then to there are only two more exhibits in the sequence. 25 is simply a document from the public. This is the PURA, which is the Connecticut Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, issues a notice of violations of folks who have excavated the gas lines. And the highlighted one is...
Again, this is the Inland Wetlands Commission.
I understand completely, but the question of whether this commission, with respect, Mr. Chairman, this commission is going to entrust the stabilization and restoration of this property to a contractor. If that were the commission's decision, who has been cited by the state, I think that's a relevant concern for the commission to consider. Finally, I have a letter. One of my colleagues, one of my neighbors, Steve Kellogg, couldn't be here tonight because of the rescheduled date. He's up in Massachusetts at a Amherst board meeting, but he asked me to share an email that he sent me on the subject. He's a Stratford resident, lives on Founders Way. So with the panel's indulgence, I would hand that up as well, with his thoughts about the subject. Provide a copy.
What has this got to do? That is irrelevant to what they're doing. They're going backwards.
We'll add that to the record.
So for the record, that was Interveners 26, which was Mr. Kellogg's letter that he asked me, or email rather, he asked me to share with the panel. I just have one or two other comments, and I'd like to ask, I think there are other opponents who'd like to speak. So just in summation, I would say that from the intervener's perspective, both interveners' perspectives, as I indicated before, this is a situation, in our view, where the commission should exercise its discretion to sever these two applications, to allow the restoration plan to proceed in whatever manner the commission sees fit, given the evidence it's heard or will hear tonight, and only allow a renewal, and then to allow a renewal application, or dismissal without prejudice of that portion of the application, so that once the stabilization or restoration along the lines that's been described by Mr. Sachs and, of course, by Mr. Danzer as well, can take hold and stabilize the land, and only then should they be allowed to come back in and present any plan for building. It's clearly our position that there are some properties that can't be built on. That what we're seeing here is this idea of moving the house around because they have to get closer to the wetlands to solve some problems with the septic or with zoning or whatever it may be. I'm not privy to all the machinations that lead to this movement, but the point is that there are some pieces of property, and maybe that's why it was for sale for $20,000, that you simply can't build on. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone here who would like to speak in favor of this petition? State your name and address for the record, please.
My name is Claudio Sanfrancesco, and me and my family, we live in Whippoorwill Lane, 320. So I'm actually the closest guy to this gentleman, which I don't never remember the last name. As much as Ed, I met him 1 year ago, and I know what he was doing. I was like, wow. That was a big change in the area, okay? Again, I am really basically the closest guys to him, and we're going to have to shut the driveway. And it was difficult at that moment. And my wife, we have 4 kids. But there was something that really, I don't think nobody knows. When I bought the house, it was really halfway built, okay? And the lot was not finished. There was nothing. There was no driveway. It was a lot to do. So it took me really, really, I would say 3 years to clean the junk that was dumped there. I never gonna forget half a cars, automobile, glasses, bottles. It was not Park Avenue. It was not Central Park. It was really terrible. I spent a lot of money in containers. I hired many people. It took me years to clean it. So, 3 years ago, we had to run to the hospital because my son cut his foot. He went inside that beautiful forest, and he got cut. You couldn't even walk inside the place. So I want to talk about artistically. I don't have any book. I don't have beautiful folders. I just, as a neighbor, think that what he did, as much as me, he cleaned up a dump. I know probably took too many trees out and it damaged our neighbors. The fact they are upset, I understand that. And I think he knows it too, and he apologized and he wanted to make it up. And I think that's what it matters. But I just want to make sure that you guys understand that that was not Central Park. That was really trash all over the place. It was terrible, dangerous. I was scared all the time that my kids would go and play there. And in that sense, me and my wife got really released from. So I just want to say, that's why I'm here and I'm sitting on this side. I have no other relationship with him, but I felt that I have to come and tell him what me and my family, as the closest neighbor, feeling about it. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else like to speak in favor?
Good evening, and thank you for allowing me to speak. My name is Mike Wilson, and basically my family has...
What is your last name again?
Wilson.
Wilson.
And my family has been in that neighborhood and on that street when the road was a dirt road, and the golf course was cow pasture. So we know a little bit about the property, and basically my relatives left us the parcels on separate deeds to sell or to keep for ourselves, and we wanted to have that nice little area there. My dad lived here, my great-grandmother lived next door, and my uncle on top of the hill, where the big house is now, that I built. I didn't finish it, but I built it. I hear all these space things looking down at the property and see that little circle, and that little tree here and all this stuff, but we're just talking, okay, the guy made a mistake. He cut some trees down. What I would like to ask is, I know that there's different wetlands in different areas, like, the marshes that are very, very important to the ecology or whatever you say that. But I was just wondering, has there ever been a study on this thing that, when was it even designated wetlands? And was there any studies on this to show the difference, to show that there was any damage? I hear all this reprehensible damage and all these big words and all this craziness and look at from the goggle this and this guy said that. And okay, the guy took some trees down with the intentions of doing better things with the lot, to improve the lot. So he could move here and become a productive member of Stratford. And he's a good guy, and the neighbors will love him. All their yards will be hooked up. They don't know what they got there. All I'm saying is I've grown up there. The property back in the day, the gentleman talked about all the junk. Yeah, back in the day, the old timers used to bury all the junk. So yeah, that property was. You couldn't walk in the trees. I don't know if any of you guys, you probably remember me. I've been here before, back on the house on the hill, but I don't know if you've ever walked the lot when there was actually trees there. You couldn't. And it wasn't because of the big trees. It was because of so much junk and briars and underbrush and crap. So, basically, the first time I went there and saw the lot, I was like, holy cow, it's great. And all the other neighbors that I talked to loved it. He cleaned it all up. It was a wreck. It was a mess. Old shacks falling down and cars in the woods.
But anyway, you know, it all boils down to the error that Brian made with the trees and with the wetlands. But is there any evidence of how crucial that wetlands plays in that area? Has there ever been any studies on it to show that, oh yes, look at now what you've done. You've definitely done this or that. I mean, people have said you've done this, you've done that, and all this nonsense, but I haven't heard any real evidence. I mean, I've heard them testify about some stuff in the water and sediment and this and that. Okay, so it can all be fixed. But all this nonsense, okay, the guy's going to fix it. I mean, that's all we're asking for. You know, and I live there, and I want to see the lot get developed. I didn't want to see it just stay like that. I was going to develop it myself, but things happened, didn't work out that way, and that's why I had to sell the house to the gentleman on the hill. And it's a great neighborhood. My dad still lives there. I go there all the time, and I just hope that we can get to the end of this, and if I can help anyway, I will be glad to, because I know the property probably better than anybody. I've been through it for quite a while, so thank you very much for allowing me to talk.
Thank you. Anyone else like to speak in favor?
Hello, my name is Richard Schnigli. I own the property at 410 Whippoorwill, which is the house on the street in front of Mr. Hirsch's property. Again, I purchased some land from Mr. Wilson, who just spoke, and like he said, it's been nothing but old farmers' junk on that property for God knows how long. I've purchased the house back in 2002 and lived there for about 10 years. Moved recently. I rent the property now. But what I think Brian's doing is nothing but an improvement to our neighborhood as a whole. Listen, we're all human. We make mistakes. He's obviously admitted his mistakes and are willing to rectify those by whatever means the commission is, going to put forth for him. But listen, I think it's a great thing for our neighborhood. It's going to help all the houses around, because now you're going to have a nice, clean piece of property with a nice little house on it that's new. It's not falling down trees, overgrown brush, junk cars, and whatever else was buried back there in that forest that was there. But I think it's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I make a comment? One of the things that I just find most disturbing about the way the lot was cleared was that if you intended to build a single-family home, why did you have to clear-cut the entire lot up to the wetlands? That's what's not making sense to me here. I understand that, yes, people make mistakes, but it was a flagrant mistake, and why did you have to go so near the wetlands? It just doesn't make sense. If you were just putting in a single-family home, you could have built it south of the ledge, closer to Whippoorwill, and you wouldn't have even had to go near the wetlands. That area could have been maintained as a forest. You could have had your house, and story over. It could have been done. It's just frustrating that you didn't follow the proper route in this. And unfortunately, now it's a big mistake. It's not just a mistake; it's a big mistake, and it's obviously upsetting to a lot of people, and understandably. And we need to take that into account when we make any decisions on this.
Anyone else like to speak in favor of this petition? Is there anyone who'd like to speak in opposition to this petition? One at a time.
Good evening. My name's Dave LaRue. I live at 325 Rosebrook Drive with my wife, Donna. And I'm glad I came here this evening because we initially...
Excuse me. Could you restate your name for the secretary, please?
Yes, David LaRue.
Thank you.
And I initially came in support of Ed and Judy Schofield and their initiative here to protect the neighborhood. But ultimately what I learned by all these different reports tonight was I think the person that, if this goes badly, would be the most affected negatively would be myself and my wife. Our house is directly at the bottom of Butternut on Rosebrook. The Pumpkin Ground Brook runs on the right of our house, and we have wetlands behind us. And any additional runoff or any additional water, groundwater that comes into that wetlands is going to be in my basement. So I would just ask the commission to please proceed carefully, however this turns out, and do everything you can so that, at least the groundwater and everything is protected. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else like to speak in opposition?
My name is Michael Malika, and I'm at 160 Butternut Lane, and the property that we have butts right up to the Mr. Hirsch's property where he's building. So none of us here are speaking on behalf of whether he's got good character, bad character. I quite frankly don't care about that. What I care about is we're minimizing a mistake. Okay? This is a willful mistake. He was asked many times whether or not he had a permit, and he said yes. We asked the town whether or not it was a legal building lot. They said no, it was not. And it still kept going on for a week or so after this was all taken care of, or supposedly should have been taken care of, and it wasn't. So all of this now, we are now left with the fact of a home being built in conjunction with land that has to be remediated, and we have to trust the person that's going to be left to do that. That's not a fair point. What have we gotten in trust right now that this land should have been not touched the way it was, not being able to put a house on, and we're saying that it could have been. So now we're left with silt fences, hay bales for 3 years while a house is being built. Everybody will go on their merry way. We'll be left in the neighborhood with a plan that may never ever get remediated. Because once that house is started, let's face it, I don't think we're going to sit here as a committee and keep coming back and watching and making sure that this is going to be done. So I'm proposing that the most sensible thing to do is to remediate the land, because the land was what it was. I don't care if there was junk on it or not. And quite frankly, it's offensive. I've been sitting on my backyard for years. I've never seen that stuff in that property. And quite frankly, when the trees came down, all I saw was machinery taking trees down, not dumpsters taking out old cars and railroad cars, or whatever else you're saying. So, quite frankly, I think what we need to do is really consider the fact that you need to remediate the land, whether it be a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years, and then decide whether or not it's buildable and he gets his permits to build the property. Thank you.
Anyone else like to speak in opposition to this?
Good evening. My name is Jay Sheehy. I live at Chapel Street. And I guess my only comment after listening to this all this evening was it appears that it was a flagrant violation of the rules. They're well known to everybody, particularly somebody in the construction industry. And I would also propose that the remediation be ordered and be sure that it's complete, whether it's a 3-year or a 5-year window, before any consideration be given to issuing a building permit for that particular lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else like to speak in opposition?
My name is Paula Malika, and I live at 160 Butternut Lane, and our property butts directly up to where the land was clear cut. And I guess I'm not here to say I'm for or against. My comment is, how did we get to this meeting? I saw the sign in August of 2016, a big sign that said land for sale. And it was on Whippoorwill, and I knew that the only house up there was this gentleman, who, it looks very pretty in blue. So I came down to Town Hall and said, what property is for sale? Because I've been living here for 18 years, and I was told there's no saleable land. So the town hall downstairs went through the records with me and said, oh, that property, it's an illegal lot. It cannot be sold, and it cannot be built on because there's too many problems with the property. Most notably, there's no sewer, there's no power lines, a whole bunch of stuff. So they said to me, you must be wrong. I said, I'm not wrong. They Google mapped, they saw the sign for sale. They still insisted the lot was not saleable and nobody could build because it was an illegal lot. Months go by.
Hold on for a moment, please.
How much is left on the next one? Okay.
Good. Okay.
So months go by, the for sale sign comes down, it's never posted that it's sold. I tell my neighbors the property must have been sold. Mr. Schofield came down, no, the property's not sold, it's still an illegal lot, it cannot be sold and built on. We must have come down to zoning 3 or 4 times and were told the property was not for sale and could not be sold. The next thing you know, I see little orange stakes almost inside my backyard. And again, I called town and I said, there's orange sticks. Somebody did a site plan because those sticks look like somebody's going to build. No. The property's not saleable. It's an illegal lot. Then the next thing you know, Monday morning, there are trucks and guys with zooming things cutting down every single tree. I literally went out there in my pajamas like I was a person in Tiananmen Square and stood in front of the foreman who told me I better back up because they didn't want me to get hurt. And I said, what are you doing? He goes, I have every permit I need to cut the trees, and this is somebody's property, and we can do what we want here. I came in, I called the town. The town said to me, we've never heard of this person. We don't even know that the property's sold. We don't know what you're talking about. So I guess my complaint or suggestion is, from when I first went there, 9 months before the clear cutting took place, how did the zoning commission not know that the property was sold? How did they not contact the seller of the property? How did they not know Mr. Hirsch bought the property? How did Mr. Hirsch not have to get permits to cut down a forested area? And now here we are tonight. So, you know what? My neighbor at 110 had to pull a permit to put up a fence so his dog could go outside. I had to get a permit because I took down 2 10-foot trees in the front of my house, and the town then physically came out and told me what kind of trees I had to plant. 2 little trees. So it's mind-boggling that a 1-acre lot was clear-cut with nobody's knowledge of what was going on. So perhaps in the future, zoning, wetlands, all the different various groups have some kind of committee or function that knows what the other is doing. So that's where we're at. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else like to speak in opposition?
Hi, good evening. Merritt Zahner on 110 Butternut Lane when this all started to go down over a year ago. I'm not smart enough to remember everything that was said tonight, so I made a couple of notes, but I definitely want to recognize everyone on this side. I do accept your apology. I'm sure this is the last place you would want to be, and I've gone through all this for whatever reason are here. I'm not a scientist. I don't speak anything about that. My only issue is that in looking at it just on a wetlands issue, does this council want to do it quickly or do they want to do it right? And the quickly is the undue burden, is the let's conjoin these things together. Yep, we promise we'll do all the remediation. Don't worry. That's the quickly one. Put it all together, make it easy, put it in a nice little package. The neighborhood will look better. Everything will be fine. No, the issue solely is the wetlands remediation issue of what happened, whether he's sorry or not, and I believe that he is, but we need to get that back. Like Ed said, it will never get back to where it was. But step one is trying to get it back to as close to where it was. Because while some people believe wetlands aren't important and there may be whatever issue may happen, that's not even for here to debate. But you guys are the stewards of the wetlands in this town. And we very much need to protect them and look at it and say, let's look at that issue first. The other issues will come. We can provide housing. Maybe we could look for something for him if he needs something beforehand. But the fact that this is about the wetlands, what was done, the restoration, how to get that back to as close to where it was, and then the next steps after that. So I am firmly on the position of separating these issues, solely looking at the remediation first, because once you guys give that sign off, then it's off to the races, and you hold no power after that. And so I'm firmly in belief of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak in opposition to this permit?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I heard once tonight or 15 times about the petition violator, I think I've heard it enough. We are here tonight to correct a violation. I think that Attorney Schofield spent at least 75% of his argument and his booklet that he passed out to this commission trashing Mr. Hirsch. Mr. Hirsch is here because he did wrong. He admitted he did wrong. We are here to correct a problem. We are attempting to correct the problem. We have hired the appropriate people. They are well-credentialed people to come up with a restoration plan and a layout and an engineering plan for the potential, and I'm going to repeat it, potential to go to the next step to build a house. For those who are caught up in the emotional aspect of this, I'll repeat briefly. If this commission approves this, and I'm going to call it a coupled petition, and I'm going to get to that in a minute, we have at least one, maybe two, further steps to go. This parcel is a lot. It is not a building lot yet. It was never suggested, nor did I testify, or did anyone for the proponents say that this is a building lot. It's a lot. It can be sold. It was sold. It's on the land records. It's taxed. It was sold by the prior owner who sold it to Mr. Hirsch for the possibility of getting the approvals to build a single-family home if we could reach that threshold. Mr. Hirsch did wrong. Mr. Hirsch did wrong. Enough. We are here to correct it. We have submitted to this commission, and Tina, you can correct me if I'm wrong, and I will apologize right here in public. It was either suggested by you or another member of the commission that we couple these petitions together so that the commission had an opportunity to ultimately see what we intended to do with this particular parcel if it got approved through the restoration process. I will testify again for the record. We are fully prepared and are willing to restore what was damaged or destroyed prior to building a home on the lot. That assumes a lot. That assumes that we are able to get it approved through the Board of Zoning Appeals and the Planning Commission. We don't know if we can do that, but the first step is coming to this commission, and we are here. Should Mr. Hirsch have come before this commission a year ago? Absolutely, he should have. Did he have conversations with Attorney Schofield? Yes, he did. Now, I heard two different stories, and we all know that somewhere between what Attorney Schofield told me and Mr. Hirsch told me, there is the truth. I don't know what the full truth is with regard to who said what to who, when they said it, who called someone a name, whether they had a permit or didn't have a permit. Well, guess what? He didn't have a permit. We're here for the permit tonight. Mr. Hirsch is willing to post a bond. Mr. Hirsch already testified through us and his experts that we are willing to give the commission a 3-year look-see. If you want a 4-year look-see, that's fine too. We are willing to restore the damaged areas immediately, fence them off, screen them off, not encroach on the wetlands, give the commission a conservation easement. But don't tie our hands in approving the second portion of this coupled petition to give us the ability to make the next step. If you want us to move that house a number of feet away from, further from the 250-foot setback, we are willing to do that. we have enough room to move it between 10 and 15 feet. And I think it was indicated to you through the engineer why we said it that way. You may agree or disagree with it. But to sit here and do nothing and say, well, we want you to restore the plan, period, and then come back with another petition 2 or 3 years from now and face the same onslaught is pretty foolish to me. Now, if Mr. Hirsch doesn't restore the property, Mr. Hirsch can't go to the next step. He can't even get me or anyone to go before the Board of Zoning Appeals and ask for a waiver for the entrance, the driveway width to the property. Commission wants to post a bond? Fine. Commission wants Mr. Sachs to sign a 3-year, a 5-year agreement to look, see, and replace? That's fine too. We've already agreed to it. Commission wants, asked through Attorney Schofield or another, another individual in opposition, what contractor would we be doing it? How could we trust Mr. Hirsch? Mr. Hirsch has already agreed that he is willing to hire an outside contractor to do the work to supervise it. With regard to Mr. Danzer's testimony, I know Mr. Danzer very well. He was, as he indicated, assistant to Mr. McCann when they were in charge of the wetlands up there in Roosevelt Forest at their offices. I've had many encounters with both of these gentlemen. They are knowledgeable. They are truthful. However, I do disagree with Mr. Danzer that there is absolutely no evidence of runoff on that property at this point in time. Once this property is restored, it will be restored to good condition. The upland area, the 250-foot, will work as it's supposed to work. Unfortunately, a lot of these large trees shouldn't have been taken down. It does take 20 or 30 years for these trees to get that way. We understand it. But to harp on the fact what he did as opposed to approving something that will help mitigate what he did is it's not only an injustice to the neighbors, it's an injustice to the property. So we need to get a restoration plan restored as approved and restore it as part of the overall approval for this coupled situation here. I will indicate to you that I did talk to, and I think, excuse me, is it Claudio? Yes. I did talk to Claudio. It is correct that a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot, a number of large trees and limbs were dumped from his property. However they got there, it certainly wasn't by him. So a lot of the trash that was on that property that was previously testified to by another one of the individuals in the audience was there prior to Mr. Hirsch actually doing work on the property, illegal work on the property. That does not mitigate the fact that he shouldn't have done it without a permit. We are seeking your permission. We are seeking a permit. We are willing to accept whatever reasonable stipulations you are to put on this. As previously indicated, there is city water up there. That house can be moved a number of feet. And it always strikes me, and I'm sure it will raise the ire of the opposition. They have looked at woods, quote unquote, for years. And I've been doing development in this town for years. And there is no question, again, that these trees, a lot of these trees should have never been taken down without a permit. But to me, it smacks a little bit of NIMBY. Not in my backyard. We don't want any further development. We are happy seeing the woods. There is enough development in that area, and now we're going to be forced to look at, conceivably, another house. Geez, that's awful. A brand new house on a 1-acre lot in a neighborhood that's probably worth $500,000 to $550,000 that he wants to make his home in Stratford. I implore this commission to approve this petition. You can stipulate it as I indicated or add any other stipulations or requirements that you wish. We will post a bond. We will adhere to the rules. We will be subject to this commission's scrutiny for as long as you require us to do what you request us to do if you approve this application. I don't like what I don't like, or what I don't want the commission to fall prey to, is what I determine is somewhat of a hatchet job because of what Mr. Hirsch did. He is here to correct the problem. He is sincere. I find him to be a gentleman. I find his wife to be a very nice lady, and I would welcome them as my neighbor on Whippoorwill Lane. And with that, I conclude my remarks. If you have any further questions before you close the public hearing of any of our experts, I am happy to have them come up and rebut.
Just one quick. Mr. Wade. Mr. Owens, this is not a wetlands question. On the application, can you tell me who Shana Wolf is?
Yes, that is Mr. Hirsch's wife.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
I thank you for your time and your patience.
Thank you. We're going to close this. We're going to close this public hearing now. Take a recess.
We need that motion.
We need a motion.
Wait, before you close, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry. I want to make sure that those boards, the drawings gets into evidence.
Yes, I have copies of everything.
We have
them. Okay.
I have an ongoing list of exhibits.
All right. Thank you.
I have a question on the public hearing itself. Tina, are you satisfied with digesting all the information that the intervener presented tonight? And you won't have any other questions further? Or do you think that we should extend the public hearing till May?
I don't believe we need to extend the public hearing. I believe we should close the public hearing and then render a decision after 35 days at our next meeting.
Okay.
That's my feeling, unless any other commissioners have a comment on that.
I just want to make sure that you're comfortable with it. That's all I'm saying.
That raises the question, though.
No.
Technically, we're not supposed to take any more information after the public hearing is closed. I know at least there's 3 or 4 different things. What's that?
No new information. She can ask for clarifications.
Oh, but I see what Bill's getting at, because if we ask them to make any changes to the plan.
If you
we
make
can't
changes in plans, you ask for profiles, you ask for other information, which is technically more information that the intervener has got to look at as well. And technically, if you close the hearing, you can't get either of
Right.
those.
That's my concern.
So, in that case, we continue the public hearing until the following meeting, our normal May meeting, except is it possible to make it that at that public hearing that we don't take any comments? We just accept any new physical documents that are turned in that were requested at the previous
Right.
hearing?
That would be the main thing. Is if you're going to need more feedback on what we have here, or we need it, okay? We could request that prior to the next public hearing or the extension. They could submit it, then it becomes part of the record. And then we could vote on that additional information. Otherwise, we only can vote on what we have right now.
Whatever they send to us,
I think we
the
got enough
application will
information.
have to have time to look at as well. So anything that we've asked for tonight, the applicant has to have to me in the Conservation Department 2 weeks ahead of our next scheduled meeting.
Well, wait a minute.
Let me look at this.
I got a question.
1 second.
Mr. Chairman, may I?
Our next regularly scheduled meeting would be May 17th. So we should continue the public hearing until that evening. And that would give the applicant until May 3rd, Wednesday, May 3rd, by close of business, to have any requested documents delivered to the Conservation Office.
All right. The public hearing is still open. You didn't close it yet, did you?
No.
All right. By way of documents, what have you requested that we haven't given you? That's going to be...
There was the cross-sectional plan. There was also the cross-sectional plan and
Alternative.
the alternative where the home was set further.
There is an obligation in our our things to show all possible alternatives.
Yeah, but
So those are the
all
two...
possible alternatives must be shown. Doesn't necessarily have to be good, but you have to be shown.
planting plan.
We could close the
the-
public hearing for now.
Hold on. For Stewart's planting plan, the intervener had suggested that he mark or label 2 trees.
Two
because it
trees.
wasn't
Give me a
slope.
break.
So, well, let's be.
All right.
Let's
Now,
be thorough.
could you enumerate that by way of email? So, all right. So what you are suggesting then, if I understand it correctly, you are leaving the public hearing open, and you are requesting 3 or 4 documents for the next hearing.
The standards for a public hearing are different than an application review. They're once, because it's more like a court of law. Once the gavel's gone down, that's it.
I understand.
So we have to comply with those, otherwise we're in trouble.
Bill, I understand, but I'm trying to understand explicitly. There are 3 or 4 items that the commission is looking for. Stop. Let me finish.
Go for it.
Thank you. We are going to submit them to Tina, the Wetlands Office, within, I guess, a 2-week period, whatever the date certain is.
Right.
May 3rd. Right. At the next public hearing, those 4 documents will be made part of the record. I understand that. Is there going to be further testimony from us and further testimony from the opponents, or are you just accepting those documents and making them part of the record so you can make a determination of which way you want to go?
It will be a public hearing, and the public will have an opportunity to speak to the changes.
Just to the changes.
Well, we're going to have, I'm
Because-
not too sure of that. I think
I
the,
don't
I think the
believe I
two
can
principals
stop
are the two that can comment on the new.
Clearly, it's a
information.
public hearing. The public has a right to speak.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I
but they
agree with
can't
that.
keep going over the same thing. They got to only talk about what we're bringing back in. They can't just talk all over again and just keep going on and on and on.
So it'll be with the understanding that we're going to address
The 4 items.
the items that are delivered to my office by May 3rd.
Are we all in agreement with that?
Oh, yeah.
You're going to have to get copies.
Only to comment on what we're bringing the 4 new items in.
Yes.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
So, we have a motion.
Is that what we're,
I'll make a motion to continue the public hearing till our May regular meeting,
I
scheduled meeting.
second it.
Do you have a second?
Second.
Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
We're going to take a short recess. How much time we got?
Oh, I would say about 15 minutes.
Hold on 1 second. Because now we have.
Yes. Right, right. Table. Meetings that I'm doing here till 11, 3.
Where did we go? I hope
Wait, hold on.
The house up 10 to 15 feet, whatever Maybe by Monday, is that gonna be enough time to redo your plan? I'll just do it myself tomorrow.
You're welcome.
Not gonna see him.
What is this? Favor, come to zoning this time. Please come. Give them that up.
I gotta do pieces, I'll be right back.
Oh,
We got a quorum, we got a quorum.
Okay, let's
yeah,
go.
it's fine. I'm fine with
We're going to open the meeting. We're going to order minutes. We're going to put this application on the table.
static.
and we'll get that out.
You're at 110?
No, I'm at 325 Rose.
Okay.
I'm married.
We're going to start a regular meeting, so if you want to keep talking, go someplace else. You're welcome to stay. Wait. What's he? All right. It is the early hour of 9:52. We'll call the public, or excuse me, the regularly scheduled meeting to order. First item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes of March 15th meeting.
Right?
I'd like to change the minutes. Is that what I was supposed to say?
No.
Yeah. What?
You want to amend them?
Have we read the minutes,
Like
and
to amend-
are there any changes?
Yes. Mr. Fay cannot be present and absent simultaneously.
You got to talk into this.
Mr. Fay cannot be present
Oh,
and
that's
absent
right.
simultaneously.
Actually, I can.
Right, that's right.
Although sometimes when he's here, we think he's absent.
Who?
So noted.
Okay, so those are amended.
Any other
I'll make a
changes?
motion to approve with the amended recommendation.
We have a second? We have a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Old business. Application.
Stay on the table. Don't take it off the table. Stay on the table. It's old business. We don't have to take it
Okay,
off.
so we'll leave that on the table. New business, there is no new business. Staff report? Nothing. Administrative permits? Nothing. Commissioners forum? Nothing. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make the motion to adjourn.
Second? Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Adjourned. How long did that take?
53. I'll tell you, I think it's me. These meetings that I'm doing.
If this is not a building right, zoning did their job. We avoid all of this.
Do you know what it could have been between when
I'm
Bill
sure
left
you're
and
absolutely
Jay came in? It might have been in the interim, you know, before we got the new zoning officer.
We require a reasonable